I'm here today with Dr. Greg Enriquez, psychology professor, and we're answering your deepest questions. So the question of the day is philosophy. What is philosophy? Why should we even care? I know when I was in college, I intentionally avoided philosophy class because it didn't seem like there'd be any real answers. It seemed like everything you could just justify one way or the other. But I've since learned a little bit about it and want to learn even more. And I think we've got something exciting for you today. So let me turn it over to you. Tell us a little bit about what philosophy is and why should we care about it?
Yeah. Well, I think you made a really important point right off the bat, and that is that most people, when they think about it, it's really abstract, you know, and so why should they care about it? They know what they're doing in their everyday world, and I think that's a very common response. I will say that I really think that I hope people reconsider that, because philosophy, it means a love of wisdom.
Okay. That sounds admirable.
And so to be wise, I think, is something worth thinking about.
Definitely.
And fundamentally, really, it's just about understanding. It's about understanding how you understand what is, okay? Understanding about kind of maybe what you should value, and really getting you thinking about the world and thinking about how to think maybe a little more clearly. And if you learn about philosophy, you learn lots of different ways, I think, to think more clearly, fundamentally.
Right, and one of the original questions, if I'm correct, is kind of like, what is truth?
Exactly.
And how can we know? Can you maybe start with like a little history where we even kind of tried to discover that and what's happened?
Yeah, so in the West, in our Western tradition, there's really a pretty clear location about when philosophy gets started. And it gets started with the ancient Greeks, about 500 years before Christ, as it were. Okay? And so I sort of like to date it, and many other people, sort of the beginning of Pythagoras. You remember Pythagoras?
Yeah, he's got a triangle,
He's got that
right?
Triangle guy,
yes.
right?
I think I can do that for you.
Yeah, sort of like A's and B's and squared and all this other stuff.
Right.
Well, what Pythagoras and his followers did was he really started to look at numbers. And of course, he was interested in geometry and other kinds of relationships of numbers and harmony, and saw ratios in the world that were mathematically describable. Okay? And then, so what Pythagoras really started to think is the root of truth is math and numbers.
Right. Math, truth must come from math, essentially.
Exactly.
Can't argue with it.
And well, actually, people do argue with that, surprisingly enough, but really in terms of giving us a framework for a truth that is different than everyday and common knowledge. There's something deeper about that mathematical truth, right? That a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that's more than just an opinion.
Right.
There's real logic there. There's real coherence. There's a deeper level of truth. And what Pythagoras started to do was started to map, and his followers map numbers onto nature, and thought that he could find truth in that. Okay? And a little while later, the guy, really the founder of modern philosophy, popped onto the scene, or really ancient philosophy in terms of, but what really transformed us was Socrates. Okay? And so what Socrates did is he noticed that people made a lot of claims. Okay? Hey, I can do this. But they would justify those claims really just through action, pragmatics. Okay? I'm the best swordsmaker, and here I made a sword, and there it is, and but he watched and saw what Pythagoras did with knowledge on math, and got to this idea of, well, you could know how to do stuff, but you didn't necessarily know that was true.
Right.
Okay?
You might know how to forge a sword, but you may not know exactly what's happening with the steel and the metal.
Precisely.
Yep.
Yeah. How do you know that what you know is really true?
Okay.
And Socrates, the Socratic method, you may have heard, really the Socratic method, Socrates, as Bill and Ted.
Got Bill and Ted.
That's real education, right? Well, the Socratic method was this questioning method of your definitions and your understanding. And what Socrates developed was a really systematic and powerful way to analyze what you know. Okay? And really, he was famous. The Oracle at Delphi was asked at one point, and who's the wisest man? And identified Socrates as the wisest man alive. And ultimately, it was really kind of ironic, because what Socrates said, the reason he was identified as wise is because what he knew was that he didn't know anything.
Gotcha.
Okay.
The old wise fool.
The old wise. Well, yeah, exactly. Kind of like, well, and really, in terms of it's really a wise person that recognizes the limitations of their knowledge.
Yep.
Okay, rather than trying to defend and be certain and be like, I know this. Some people out there, we see that.
Isn't that like a Dunning-Kruger effect?
Yeah. Well, actually,
you know a lot, and you kind of curve
exactly. People exactly.
realize,
when people are asked their own competence or their own expertise, they're often very, very misguided.
Right.
You know, and a lot of people who are pretty clueless think that they know stuff.
Yep.
Well, Socrates was very, very clear on helping develop a framework for questioning what you knew. Okay. And he really left the stage, and when he dies, he created lots of kind of controversy, and ultimately by the government thought he was a troublemaker, and ultimately had him drink hemlock and die. They sentenced him to death
because he's asking all these questions, which people don't like. Right.
And then ultimately he gives rise to two great philosophers, and this is why him, especially with the background of Pythagoras, into these two guys. You may have heard of them. The first of his pupils was Plato. Okay. And in fact, everything we know about Socrates really comes from Plato. Socrates didn't write anything down.
All right.
But he was the big questioner, and then Plato told his story. Okay. And what's interesting about Socrates is he created this framework, which technically is called epistemology, but it's just how do you know?
Right.
Okay?
So how do you know?
How do you know what you know? And that really planted the seed in Plato. Well, okay, I want to build a system of knowledge. Okay? And what is fundamentally real? And Plato ultimately develops a system called idealism, which he made this very interesting argument that what ultimately is real are forms. Okay? Ideal forms, like the form of a circle. All right? And kind of you can make some connections to mathematics.
Say tie it back in with that a little.
So for our understandings at this point, you kind of think about what's the most fundamentally real for Plato, sort of ideas like mathematics. Okay? And that was his ultimate reality. And then his pupil, another guy you may know, you got Socrates
teaches Plato,
and then Plato teaches Aristotle. Okay? And Aristotle hoped, so Socrates then starts this academy, and then Plato takes over, and Aristotle hopes he would take over, but they had some power struggles. And one of the things that was really different is that Aristotle disagreed with Plato about what the fundamental essence of reality was. He argued that really matter, physical matter, was the core essence. And humans developed ideas as ways of categorizing matter. But really the forms came mostly from us and were placed on them. So a circle is something we developed to describe. It doesn't exist in its own plane from Aristotle. Well, those are really fascinating debates. And indeed, to this day, we have people that debate the ultimate nature. Is it more like math? Is it more like physics?
Okay.
Got it. And so you have the spa explosion from Socrates to Plato to Aristotle.
Right, SPA.
SPA,
yep. Good
exactly. And really what we call it Western philosophy because Western philosophy was fundamentally about trying to get at what this abstract concept of truth was, right? Like what's true in the deepest ways. And we were talking some about, it's kind of abstract, right? What's ultimate truth and really
and then how can you tell me that it's not or it is?
Right. And it is complicated. And if you get into it, there are better arguments than others, right? Obviously, but for your everyday, hey, I got to get a job and I got to eat a sandwich,
right?
What the hell is real truth? And a lot of people find that to be pretty abstract. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, about what we call Western philosophy is that it's concerned with that. There's a whole nother branch on the other side of the world, Eastern philosophy, that really has a different focus. Folks in Asia, in India, and all of those areas, their thinking of philosophy is much more pragmatic. Philosophy then for them, although they're very, of course, sophisticated and all these different thousands of years of thought, but fundamentally the question really for the philosophers in the East is much more pragmatic. Which means it's really like, well, how do you live?
How does this impact me?
Exactly.
What can I do? Right.
And so I'll give you the story of Siddhartha really fast, because Buddhism, for example, is a great example of an Eastern philosophy. And there was a prophecy about Siddhartha. He was a prince about the time of Socrates in India, and the prophecy was either he was going to be a great king, he was a prince, and so the king, his own king, his father, was like, hey, okay, great, or he's going to be this great spiritual, wise leader. And his dad was like, well, I hope he's a great king. Like, you know, yeah, that's
I've got the treasure you're getting.
So he tried, and this is an interesting point about fate and everything else, so he tried to protect Siddhartha and create a very isolated kingdom for him. Okay, and so for the first 28, 29 years or so, he lived this very pristine life in a very privileged way, surrounded by beautiful, healthy people, got married, had some kids and things like that, but it was very isolated.
Right.
But then as an adult man, he realized, okay, there are something beyond the walls, and I'm curious. And he got his servant or whatever to take him out.
Right.
Okay, and on a journey. And so he gets outside the walls, and very quickly, what does he encounter but suffering and death?
Right.
And famine and poverty and all the stuff that his father had protected him from.
Sure.
Okay? And this has just an enormous impact on him. Okay? And ultimately, he then realizes that actually, oh my God, the world is filled with suffering. And then this issue about, well, what is this? How do we deal with this?
Mm-hmm.
Okay? How do we address all of this pain? And that became a fundamental focus of him. Ultimately, what he does is he tries to, okay, maybe we can fix it and do other things, and then ultimately develops basically a mindset, okay, a way of learning how to be aware of and accept pain, and recognize that suffering there, and what he really saw at the root of suffering was the inability to accept pain and the desire to run away from it, which is natural, but if you do that, it's you try to resist and escape from pain. Ultimately, that's the root of a lot of suffering. And that's why you may have heard in Buddhist mindfulness elements, the key emphasis is mindful awareness and acceptance.
Right.
Okay? And with that, how do you do that? You train the mind, you do lots of meditation.
Okay.
If we come back to philosophy, why is that interesting or important? You see in the East, the focus there is on how to live, how to deal with pain.
Right.
Okay.
Pain, and the pain is not, the goal is not to avoid it, it's you're going to experience it.
Exactly.
Let's handle how we could do it. That may even tie into another talk when we talk about parenting and things like that.
Absolutely.
The goal, right, is not necessarily just to completely shelter, but you're going to have some hardship. So let's learn how, so it doesn't break us, let's learn how to actually kind of handle that. And that does sound much more kind of everyday, okay, I feel like I could use that.
Exactly.
Right.
And if you are in Eastern traditions, you will see, if you go into those cultures, Buddhism is everywhere. It's like it's a religion, or if you want to call it that. It's a philosophy or religion or whatever. But it really informs them. For us, kind of Christianity or whatever, we don't think of Christianity necessarily as philosophy.
Right.
Okay, so that's the difference.
Okay.
But it's fundamentally more concerned with sort of the pragmatic everyday living and how to live a valued and meaningful life. Western philosophy tends to focus more on the idea of the truth.
Okay.
Okay.
So we left off with Aristotle,
Exactly.
he was doing stuff, then we kind of talked about Eastern. Have there been some more, are we up to date, or is there still some more stuff we
Right,
want to
actually,
talk about?
that's really,
Nothing has happened in
happened in the last
2,000
2,500 years. No, I mean, we will fast forward. I'll fast forward into modern, sort of what might be called modern Western philosophy.
Okay.
And the guy probably most commonly associated with the modern Western is René Descartes.
René Descartes, okay.
So he was a mathematician and a thinker and somebody who did lots of different things. And you may have even heard of the phrase, I think, therefore I am.
Got it. Yep.
Okay? Well, René Descartes was trying to figure out how to make sense out of the world, like philosophy does, what is true.
Right.
Okay? And he adopted, kind of like Socrates in some ways, he adopted a very skeptical attitude. All right? Well, how do I know? What do I really know? What can I never... Even if my greatest skeptical ideas are, this is not true, this is not true, he realized, I don't even know that this cup is really out here in the real world. Mm-hmm. Okay? Anybody seen The Matrix?
Sure.
Yeah.
Which pill am I going to take? Right?
Well, what is the whole premise of The Matrix is that you live, actually what you thought was the real world isn't the real world at all.
It's all in your head.
It's all in your head. Well, actually, René Descartes had that idea a long time ago.
Okay.
And for him, instead of an artificial intelligence, it was an evil demon that was playing a trick on him for whatever purpose.
Right.
And so he thought of basically the idea, I could be in a matrix.
Right. And a little petri dish somewhere
Yeah,
in
it
just
could
my
be.
brain.
How would I know?
Right.
It could have been all a dream. But what he realized is even in that level of skepticism that the world might not be real, even his ideas about the world were real.
Right.
Okay,
So that brain was still functioning no matter what.
well, really, it's his thinking was functioning.
Right.
Even if it was in a brain, how do you know? That could be
Right.
a dream too.
Okay.
But he couldn't convince himself that he wasn't a thinking entity. Because even if he started to say, well, maybe I'm not a thinking entity,
Right.
guess what he was?
Right. I'm thinking about not thinking.
I'm thinking about not thinking.
So
So
I'm
it has
thinking-
this recursive loop, so he couldn't deny that he was a thinking entity.
Got it. Thus, I think. Therefore, I am.
Exactly. That's
Okay.
that's the root of that becomes an anchor point for his ideas and his way of thinking. The ultimately, why is that really important today? Well, in the West, trying to get a true, philosophically sound relationship between what is mind,
Right.
okay, or consciousness and your thoughts, and what is that, and how does it relate to the physical world?
The matter.
The
right.
matter of the world.
Okay.
This is mind-body problem. It's the mind-body problem. It probably, I would argue, is if you're going to say what's the most fundamental question in philosophy, in Western philosophy, it's this relationship between mind and matter.
All right.
Okay, at a knowledge level. So
Right.
what is the best way, or what are the truest ways to really think about what the mind is? How does it relate to the external world? How does it relate to the brain? And how do we build a
There's
system
isn't
that
there
makes
like a
sense?
table challenge or sort of table question about that? Like, is the table here or is it in your head?
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
right. So when you, it is certainly the case that there's out here.
Right.
Okay. And that's my experience. I'm looking right now at this table.
Mm-hmm.
But if you were to cut my head open and peer inside, there's nothing like a table inside my head.
Correct.
Right. And you have your experience of the table. I can never see your experience of the table.
Right.
Right. I only have access to my experience of the table. Okay, so a guy who comes off after Rene Descartes, Immanuel Kant, a very, very famous philosopher, talked about the phenomena, which is our experience of the table.
Okay.
Okay, and that's really the only thing that we ever have access to.
Right.
Versus the noumena, which is the reality in and of itself, which we never have direct access to.
Right. You have to have the observer to even kind of
Exactly.
start the whole equation.
Yeah, and at some
Okay.
level, it's that relationship between a subjective perception and the outside world. And in some ways, that subjective perception is contained. That's some of the things that make it tricky. I blew my niece's mind when I was like, your color experience of red, you'll never confirm that anyone else experiences red that way.
Right.
And she was like, well, obviously, I just asked them. I was like, well, no, because you can't see.
Sure.
And if they learned what red was, but it's really different, but their label for it, you would never know.
Right. And you're walking around
Right.
thinking all
And
this
she was
time.
like, "Oh my God,
Right.
I can't get outside my own head."
That's right.
And
You're
when
stuck
you
in there.
right when you realize that's really kind of cool. So that's one. So understanding how you think about mind, obviously that's kind of abstract,
Right.
Okay, but I think what you think of as mind when if you're a religious person, for instance. Kind of how you justify that and what you think about that.
Right.
How does your mind work? I mean, those are interesting questions. I think another thing that philosophy really gets at that's more common that gets back to some of these issues also is values.
Right. I was just going to say, so going on today, like, what's an
Exactly.
issue where we would turn to philosophy to help us answer that people in 2018 are struggling with?
Perfect. And I think that the question about it is, well, what do we think about in terms of what is good, is really good philosophers, the philosophy of ethics or morality.
Okay.
Okay. And I think this is a really important problem because I think we've lost a lot of clarity about what is good.
Right.
Okay. I think what's happened, especially as religion has lost some of its authority, and really, we're here saying, who knows philosophy, whatever, so that doesn't have much authority. Science doesn't tell us what good is,
Right.
that much. It just more or less tells us what's true. So kind of where do we get our values from?
Right.
Well, philosophy's done a lot of good work, and it has a number of different possible models. Okay, and what I would say is we definitely need some notions. One, for instance, is sort of a utilitarian model.
Right.
We'll try to do what's good for us, and then what's good for people in general.
Right, so it's good for me. Although if I steal money from you, that's good for me
Yeah.
short term, but then that
Well, then it
causes all
hurts
sorts of-
me, right? So how do you be in such a way, the utilitarian kind of principle is, well, how do you be in such a way that maximizes good in general?
Right.
Right. How can you live your life in a way that maximizes good and minimizes harm?
Okay.
Okay?
That seems pretty valuable.
And it's not just for you, but it's for people in general to be really at a broad level. So, okay, how can I position myself for that? Others, like Immanuel Kant, come back and argued that there were core concepts of duty, like honesty.
Right.
Okay? And to live a good life is to identify with those core called them categorical imperatives of being, and to live up to those standards and to have a duty for that.
Right.
I emphasize three big values: human dignity, well-being, and integrity.
Human
Okay.
dignity, well-being, and integrity.
Exactly.
All right.
And so everybody has dignity. That's sort of the aesthetic respect that we have. When you look at somebody and say, hey, I don't want them to suffer,
Right.
I value them.
Okay.
Right? And then well-being, are you kind of happy on the inside? Do you have good resources? Okay. And are you living a valuable and value-laden life?
Okay.
Okay? And then integrity, are you honest and are you clear? Those
Right.
are some examples. And I have reasons for one of those things. But fundamentally, the point here is kind of how you understand yourself, all right, what's going on, how do you make sense out of the self, and what is good, and what are the ways in which you can live your life. Now, I think virtually anybody, if you actually were reflecting on kind of living, those are kind of questions.
That sounds pretty important.
Those are
That
pretty
sounds like
grounding.
something I should spend some time thinking
at
about.
some level, you're going to sort out kind of what choices you're going to make.
Right.
And I'll end with this kind of point, is really from a psychological perspective, the really task of your adulthood is to how do you weave a story together of who you are and how do you make it cohere. And really the value questions and the meaning-making questions are what makes that story cohere. So fundamentally, I would say if you're going to live a storied life that feels generative, answering these questions is absolutely essential.
I totally agree, and that does sound extremely important. We hope you enjoyed this. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. We've got many more videos coming your way, answering your deepest questions. In the meantime, keep learning, keep assimilating, keep utilizing that knowledge. That's the very definition of living.